seriously popular.
It's 2025, a new year and the best time to turn your great idea into a business. Shopify is how you're going to make it happen. Let me tell you how. Shopify makes it simple to create your brand, open for business, and get your first sale. Get your store up and running easily with thousands of customizable templates. All you need to do is drag and drop. Their powerful social media tools let you connect all your channels and create shoppable posts. Established in 2025. Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/promo. All lowercase. Go to shopify.com/promo to start selling with Shopify today. Shopify.com/promo.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous 2-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
The phrase we used was the IRA and Sinn Féin in those days were inextricably linked. That was the phrase we used.
Paul Murphy is a peer and former Labour MP. In 1997, he was a minister in the Northern Ireland office and a key negotiator in the Good Friday Agreement.
But we knew that the leadership of Sinn Féin had access to the leadership of the IRA. Martin McGuinness, I don't think, ever made any secret of it.
Martin McGuinness was a Sinn Féin politician and former leader of the IRA in Derry.
Occasionally said to me, jokingly, I said, "Martin, I'm off to Derry tomorrow to look at the walls." He said, "That's all right, Paul." He said, I'll call the boys off," laughing. But that's how things had developed.
He was laughing, but there was always a reminder of who he was.
And what had happened in the past.
At the start of the 1990s, the prospect of peace in Northern Ireland seemed like a distant dream. By the end of the decade, it was a tentative but undeniable reality. To get there, people on both sides, who'd experienced unimaginable loss at the hands of their enemies, had to sit down and talk. And in order to do that, it became absolutely necessary for the British and Irish governments to recognise Sinn Féin as not just a political wing of a terrorist organisation, but a legitimate political force to negotiate with. I don't think I'd be overstating it when I say that the Good Friday Agreement is one of the most extraordinary peace agreements ever signed. So what was Sinn Féin's role in this singular moment in modern history? And was the agreement enough to bring a lasting peace? I'm John Lee, Executive Editor of the Daily Mail in Ireland, and this is From Bomb to Ballot, the history of Sinn Féin. Episode 5, Call the Boys Off.
I was 30 years old. After university, I'd spent 6.5 years in the Navy and then sort of broken into journalism relatively late.
Toby Harnden is a journalist and author who first started reporting on Northern Ireland in 1995. The IRA had declared a ceasefire the year before, but that didn't mean the violence had gone away.
I got this kind of strong sense there were a lot of punishment attacks going on by the IRA or IRA front groups. Now, I think there was a sense in the newsroom that the story was over. There was a ceasefire since August 94, and Northern Ireland was sort of dropped down the news agenda. There would be, political talks. I felt it was a very live story, but I had this strong sense that it wasn't over.
Negotiations were ongoing about what the next stage of the peace process might look like, and it wasn't going smoothly. The British government told Sinn Féin if they wanted to have a seat at the negotiating table, the Provos needed to give up at least some of their weapons. At no point in history had the IRA handed over their arms, and they sure as hell weren't going to start now. Not at least until they'd had assurances that they wouldn't be the only ones. Loyalist paramilitaries were responsible for nearly a third of the deaths during the conflict. Martin McGuinness spoke to journalists in 1994.
We went into the meeting with a position that we wanted to discuss how we can take all the arms out of Irish politics. And all the arms means not just the IRA's arms, but the arms which British soldiers have, which the Loyalist death squads have, many of whom have been given to them by elements within British military intelligence.
But it was no good. The talks reached a stalemate, and in February 1996, the IRA took matters into their own hands.
I was in the Canary Wharf building. I believe we were on about the 20th floor, and there was just this huge explosion. The building, which was a massive building, one of the tallest buildings in London, briefly shook. Some people dived under their desks, and the cry went up from the news desk, get over there. And the lifts were out. And so we ran down the stairs, 20 floors or whatever it was, and ran over to South Quay. And I spent the rest of that evening reporting on the bomb. So I remember all the sort of the glass underneath my feet, the police, the sirens, all that stuff. And while reporting, I was also thinking, okay, so I'm going over to Belfast next month.
The Docklands bombing marked the end of the longest ceasefire of the Troubles. It caused £150 million in damage, injured 40 people and killed 2. 4 months later, the IRA let off a bomb in Manchester. There were no fatalities, but it was the biggest bomb detonated in Britain since the Second World War.
In Christopher Andrews' official history of MI5, he has a quote there from what I presume is like MI5's archive.
Historian Thomas Lee.
And they say, with that level of weaponry, the IRA can just probably continue indefinitely with that kind of small-scale level campaign. So I think that's one reason. There was a realisation for the others that this isn't going to go away, they can keep this up, and they're quite willing to keep this up if needed.
Whether the British and Irish governments liked it or not, peace wasn't possible without the cooperation of the Provisional IRA. And in reality, this meant it wasn't possible without Sinn Féin. But with IRA activity ongoing, they continued to refuse Sinn Féin a seat at the table, and they were excluded from the early peace talks in Northern Ireland. Others, though, were making contact.
There was a women's rights campaign from the 70s. So by the mid-90s, we'd been around for about 25 years.
We last heard from Monica McWilliams at the very start of this series, when she was an 18-year-old involved in the civil rights movement. It won't surprise you to hear that in the intervening years, Monica continued to fight for peace and equality in Northern Ireland.
Some had cut our political teeth in the civil rights movement, others in the trade union movement, others in the anti-sectarian organisations for integrated education. So when the opportunity came in 96, and I'd already held a huge conference in Draperstown asking women if there were to be peace talks, would they be women at the table, and if not, what would we do about it? And the answer was a resounding, we need to do something about it, given that we've been working at the interfaces and the front lines and holding the families together. And very quickly, we decided to co-found the Women's Coalition.
Monica was acutely aware of the unique position women held in the conflict. Protestant or Catholic, nationalist or unionist, women shared common experiences which could bridge the divide and pave the way to peace. And that's what she did with the women of Sinn Féin after the IRA broke the 1994 ceasefire.
We decided that we would reach out and do back-channel talks with them. And we made contact first with the women in Sinn Féin and then later with the men. Occasionally we'd get locked out. We met in a couple of pubs and then we met in the back of the car because we got locked out one evening. We had been doing this quietly, under the radar, secretly, which is where some of the best relationships are built.
By the late 1990s, the mood in Northern Ireland was decidedly for an end to fighting. Large peace rallies were held in Belfast and Gerry, and there was a general sense that the conflict had gone on too long. People were tired and they wanted change. This sentiment was expressed at one meeting of the Women's Coalition.
Someone said quietly from the back of the room, "It's time to wave goodbye to dinosaurs." And it struck me that that was exactly what we were trying to do. And so I went home and went down the street and found someone who could do desktop publishing, which was something we'd not heard of, and asked him to design a poster with a dinosaur on it and wrote those words on it. And then I ran off to the printers and got these posters printed, and it became a point of amusement to some in other parties who said, "How dare you call us a dinosaur?" And the answer was, "Is your name on that poster? And if it's not, why are you self-identifying?" It certainly didn't help us with the other parties, but I guess people were just sickened with the violence and just sick of what was passing for politics, that the dinosaur title stuck.
The Northern Ireland Women's Coalition took part in initial peace talks in 1996, along with Unionists and Nationalists. But it would be in 1997 that the push towards peace really gained momentum in the form of two fresh-faced new leaders.
When Bertie Ahern came in and Tony Blair, I knew the dynamic was going to change.
Yes, the actual personalities of the two leading players, Prime Minister Blair and Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, were hugely significant in a number of ways.
Northern Ireland Minister Paul Murphy again.
First of all, their personal chemistry was very good. They got on very well together. Now, that might be, a truism and commonplace, but relations between Britain and Ireland have not been very good for many years, and very often the relations between the heads of government and the various foreign ministers have been very poor. But their relations were stunningly good, and I watched them in action, literally for 5 years, and I saw this common goal they had of trying to ensure we get peace in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, bound them together. But they had that personal chemistry.
We had built up a very good relationship in opposition. I found them really good to deal with.
That's Bertie Ahern. He and Tony Blair had been in touch with each other before either of them had been elected premiers of their respective countries, regularly meeting in Dublin and London to discuss the future of peace in Northern Ireland.
He was straightforward in all my years dealing with him. There was never any, underhand dealing or two-faced issues. You dealt with the issues. Of course, we didn't always agree, but we worked hard to have a unitary position and to try to find compromises. And I think we worked extremely well together. I found him a really great person to work with and deal with.
Here's Tony Blair speaking to PBS in 2023 about working with Bertie Ahern.
I was lucky in having a group of people in Northern Ireland, leaders who were prepared to lead and do difficult things. I had an Irish Taoiseach, an Irish Prime Minister, that had we were coming to the end of the 20th century and you needed people with a kind of 21st century mentality of the world, and Bertie had that.
And so we were working out, and the plan was very simple, that we'd give this one big shot in our first year after the election if both of us were successful. And the plan was that if we got in, we would try and resume the ceasefire. He would go to Balmoral to the agriculture show, make a speech of his support for the union, and then that we would try and get multi-party talks going, which we did in September 97. We would try and get the loyalist parties to partake in it. We'd get Sinn Féin in for the first time, and we'd intensely work to try and find a solution.
Exactly as they planned, in May 1997, on his first official visit outside London since becoming Prime Minister, Blair addressed Sinn Féin directly.
The settlement train is leaving. I want you on that train, but it is leaving anyway, and I will not allow it to wait for you.
The same month, he appointed Mo Mowlam as the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. She was the first woman to hold the post and was formidable.
Mo Mowlam's celebrated informality was much in evidence as she arrived in Belfast with a mock grimace for the boisterous media scrum that awaited her. After restoring order, she insisted on first taking questions from women journalists, who asked her what she was bringing to the job.
Sensitivity in some senses, but at the same time a directness and an openness which may help the process too.
She was wonderful. She was a great friend of mine, and she was absolutely not just committed to it, she threw herself completely into it.
In all the documents, there are parts which some parties agree with and some parties disagree with. That's inevitable. If that wasn't the situation, we wouldn't be having negotiations.
I think her personality and her commitment and the way she entered into this.
Alf Dubs was another Labour politician who was present at the negotiations.
She was touchy-feely. She was a street politician, and I think that went down very, very well among a lot of people in the North. I believe she made such an impact personally that I'm not sure the peace process would have happened without her.
By June, the British government had announced that the IRA no longer had to give up its weapons for Sinn Féin to join the talks. By July, the IRA had announced another ceasefire. And by September, Sinn Féin had entered the room. They met Tony Blair for the first time.
Gerry Adams decides to give Blair a gift.
Dr. Eleanor Williams is an assistant professor at Dublin City University.
And it was a small Irish harp made from Irish wood, Irish materials. And he told Tony Blair that here's the gift, but this is the only part of Ireland that he wishes the British to keep by the end of this process. So very tongue-in-cheek, but quite symbolic.
For others, the arrival of Sinn Féin was no laughing matter. The Democratic Unionist Party was outraged. Their firebrand, Ian Paisley, told journalists,
This present process is dead in the water. The fact is that IRA Sinn Féin has bombed its way to the negotiating table, and nothing less than the empty chairs of the Unionists at that table will demonstrate the rejection of this Iscariot act of betrayal.
I remember the day vividly, both them going and DUP going out the other way. I mean, Ian Paisley left the talks because he wouldn't join them. And then the Ulster Unionist Party and the smaller Loyalist parties had to make up their own mind whether they'd continue if Sinn Féin came in. Well, eventually they did come in very dramatically, because Mo and I were in our office, or in her office, watching all this drama unfolding out in front of us, coming through the gates and coming into Castle Buildings. So you had David Trimble, David Irvine, and the leaders of Ulster Unionism, but not including the DUP, walking in. And you had Gerry Artemis and Martin McGuinness, and those walking in as well. And Mo and I were watching this behind a curtain in the offices and really marveling at what an amazing moment this was, that we're going to get a situation where Sinn Féin and the Unionist parties were in the same room together. Now, it doesn't mean to say they were talking to each other, because they weren't in those early days. And it fell on me, for example, to chair when Gerry Adams came in to the meeting and started speaking Irish. So I couldn't, and of course this caused a bit of a consternation amongst the Unionist side, and so I thought, I'm going to deal with this. And so I'm not a Welsh speaker, but I know a little bit of Welsh. So I said, let's have a bit of chwarae teg here, shall we? Which means give and take, basically. Let's have a bit of give and take.
Lovely word.
And of course, teg, if you pronounce it teg, it refers to people like me, a derogative term for Catholics. And so they fell about laughing. And so the atmosphere did change, and we started. Now that eventually, over the months, turned into proper negotiations between parties.
All the time we felt that if we didn't make this work, we might not get a chance like this again. Because the Irish government, British government had never been in the same room before. Sinn Féin were now at the table. And then I knew things were going to take off.
The negotiations were due to start in earnest in the spring of 1998. But trust building is a tricky thing, and both sides eyed each other up closely.
That Christmas went terribly wrong.
Bertie Ahern again.
People now say, that it was progressive and incremental progress from September 97. Unfortunately, that's wrong, because what happened was we split up in mid-December for the Christmas period, and then there was a number of killings, including the killing of the loyalist leader in the prison. And then there was IRA were responsible, or at least they were blamed for killings.
It was a rough time in the start of the peace talks. Places were being burned down, churches were being burned down, parish halls, orange halls were being burned down, hate speech was everywhere.
And in this febrile environment, opportunities for miscommunication abounded. Paul Murphy remembers a visit from Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness to Downing Street in December.
We were waiting there for them to come in, and there were so many press outside. I've never seen as many cameras. And when they started flashing, above the door in number 10, there's a window. And you actually thought there was lightning. There was so much flashing and electricity going off in the air that it was incredible. I've never seen anything like it in my life.
It was the first time in 76 years a British Prime Minister had received political allies of the IRA. The last time had been in 1921, when the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George met a group of Sinn Féin leaders for the negotiations that led to the partition of Ireland.
And we were all in there, Blair, Mo, myself, all waiting for them, because this was, a unique occurrence. It's the famous time when McGuinness said, talked about, is this where it happened? And I've forgotten who said to me, they referred on the government side. Oh, you mean when you tried to blow the cabinet up?
The IRA had launched a mortar attack into the garden of Downing Street in February 1991.
No, we said, when Lloyd George signed the treaties. But it was a unique experience.
Then there were the discussions about releasing Republican prisoners for Christmas.
It was very important that there was prisoner releases, and of course everyone was afraid what was going to happen. But Martin had implored on me the importance of getting some of these people out, and for the simple purpose, not giving away any trade secrets, the simple purpose he had to convince the Army Council that they were on the right strategy and that I was a guy they could trust.
Martin McGuinness had been convicted of IRA membership in 1973. He was now leading the Sinn Féin delegation at peace talks, but was still well respected by the Provisional IRA.
Martin had given me named people that he wanted out for the Christmas period, and it was left for me and Martin to sort it out, and we did. And I remember the Christmas, I was worried that they'd all come back in, but Martin assured me they would come back in, or he'd deal with it. And I took his assurances, but I was very glad to get his call on Stevens' night about 10:30 to be told that they were all safely back in.
To prison. What would have happened to them if they hadn't arrived?
Well, I think Martin would have dealt with it. But it was an important confidence building message.
Day by day, trust was growing.
At New Balance, we believe if you run, you're a runner. However you choose to do it. Because when you're not worried about doing things the right way, you're free to discover your way. And that's what running's all about. Run your way at newbalance.com/running.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The new year brings new health goals and wealth goals. Protecting your identity is an important step. LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, LifeLock's restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Resolve to make identity health and wealth part of your New Year's goals with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
You had set a deadline, Holy Week, Good Friday, fell I think on the 10th of April, 1998. What was the hastening towards that then in the early months of 1998?
Number of things.
Paul Murphy again.
Frustration, almost a murder a day. The Points Pass murder of one young Protestant, one young Catholic, both friends, both killed in this pub, did change the mood. And people suddenly realised that this wasn't just a talk about setting up parliaments, it was a talk about stopping a war. And so that concentrated the minds together with the deadline, because you could talk forever. I had to listen to hours and hours and hours and hours of people talking at each other, to me. But that was important because it was, in a political way, letting off the steam of decades, even centuries, doing that. But sooner or later, you had to come and make the agreement.
The talks that took place in Castle Buildings, an architecturally uninspiring complex of government buildings in Belfast, in the spring of 1998, were the culmination of months, arguably years, of back and forth. They'd be chaired by the American Senator George Mitchell. He'd come up with the ground rules for the talks back in 1996, including one which said all participants had to commit to non-violence. Everyone had signed up to the Mitchell Principles, as they were known, but the shadow of violence was still ever present in the room.
I remember in the early parts and discussions, one of the loyalist leaders, who I won't name, but a famous one, well-known one,
Bertie Ahern,
who said, as far as we know, Prime Minister, he wouldn't call me Taoiseach, as far as you know, Prime Minister, you're the odd one out in this room. And of course, I guessed what was coming. And I said, well, looked around and I said, I'm a Manchester United Dublin supporter. And he said, no, you're the only one in the room who hasn't murdered somebody. You know, now the reason he said it wasn't to be funny. He was trying to unnerve me and unsettle me as we got into 4 hours of negotiations. But it was a good learning curve to deal with people who you knew who had been at the heart of the troubles.
How can I put it? It was strange to see people who you'd only seen on the television before in certain circumstances and then work with them. On one occasion, to give you an example, Mo Molan and I, Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, were in her office eating fish and chips for Friday's supper. Martin McGuinness said to us, whoever would have thought that Gerry and I would be in a room eating fish and chips with two British ministers? And I said, whoever would have thought that two British ministers would be in the same room as you two eating fish and chips? But it was like that. And we had to make it as ordinary as possible and to put behind, out of our minds, because as soon as your mind became cluttered with atrocities and bombings and everything else that had gone on both sides, then you wouldn't be able to move on.
And there were moments of genuine compassion and connection.
Gerry Adams's nephews were killed in a car accident, and I expressed condolences at the table, and it began that others did likewise, even through the chair rather than directly to him. But those moments were when you finally recognised the humanity in people.
Martin McGuinness, I talked for an hour with him about his father, who'd worked in a foundry, like my father had been a coal miner, and that had he, Martin McGuinness, been brought up in, I don't know, Blackburn or somewhere, he probably would have been a Labour politician, just like me.
I asked Bertie Ahern how he found negotiating with Sinn Féin's leaders, Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness.
Yeah, I liked the two of them, and you know, I was friends with the two of them, but Martin was chief negotiator and Gerry was president of Sinn Féin, and Martin was black and white. If you made a suggestion to Martin, or if there was something that was going wrong or right, Martin would tell you very straight, and in 2 sentences you knew where it was, where he would float. Gerry, I suppose, played a different role, you know, good cop, bad cop. And Gerry, you were never quite sure what the issue was. But, you know, in hindsight, you have to look back and say the two of them were involved in and this is their credit, in a tricky project.
As the deadline for the agreement got closer, the commitment to the process intensified.
It was an enormous pressure cooker, going through the night, literally, on 2 nights. You had a couple of hours sleep and that's about it. And of course, in all this, Bertie Ahern's mother died, and he had to go to the funeral and come back. How on earth he coped with that is anybody's guess, but he did because of his commitment to it, you know.
Mo Molan had been diagnosed with a brain tumour in the run-up to the 1997 general election.
I'm fine. As you can tell, my hair's nearly back, and the hairdresser just had a quick chance to cover the bald spot, which is still there. But I got the all clear 6 months after the radiotherapy, and when I was as fat as I am now and had less hair than I do now, I was described by a journalist who didn't know I had been on steroids and therefore was fat and had no hair and a bit bulbous, as something like the back end of a Geordie truck or something. Yeah. And I don't blame her, because she didn't know what I'd been through. I did look like a back end of a Geordie truck. And Michael Parkinson brought it up in a kind of vaguely derogatory way towards Geordie truck drivers. And I just said I quite like Geordie truck drivers.
And I knew that she had chemotherapy because by then she was wearing a wig.
Monica McWilliams.
But she was incredible. And I often ask myself now, did she take the risks that she did and build the relationships that she did, particularly with Sinn Féin as a British Secretary of State, because she knew that she was so ill and this was definitely something she wanted to do, because it was a few years later that she passed away. But the night of Holy Thursday going into Good Friday morning, I met her in the corridor and she had an intravenous drip in her arm. She was in bare feet and no wig and was working herself into the ground.
When these determined faces emerged, bleary-eyed and over-caffeinated from castle buildings, they'd worked through the night to bring the talks to a successful close.
Well, I certainly believe that today will be a very good Friday.
It wasn't so much a tension, it was a mounting sense of excitement, to be honest, that it looked as though we were going to be able to get there, and everybody in there realises just what that means, how historic that is. Despite how tired we've been, the excitement's been mounting, because we all know there's a deal there, and it's not far from being made.
Certainly we're well on our way towards an agreement.
People talk about negotiations if it's some sort of fine science. Well, it isn't. It's about people dealing with people. It's an art rather than a science.
And at 5:30 p.m. on Good Friday, the 10th of April 1998, Senator George Mitchell announced that an agreement had been reached.
A historic day at Stormont after 2 years of talks and after a generation of bloodshed and decades of division and acrimony, George Mitchell ushers in what the whole island hopes will be a new era of peace.
In these past few days, the irresistible force, the political will, has met the immovable object, the legacy of the past, and it has actually moved it.
And today's historic agreement marks a new beginning for all of us in Northern Ireland, on the island of Ireland, and in these islands.
The people in Northern Ireland have always asked and said, if only the politicians would sit down together and talk and reach an agreement. Today, we have done it. We have interrupted the culture of failure in Northern Ireland. There is no going back.
The Good Friday Agreement established a power-sharing arrangement in Northern Ireland between Unionists and Nationalists. It disbanded the controversial Royal Ulster Constabulary, created a new police force, and allowed for the early release of prisoners connected with paramilitary groups. And it paved the way for a future vote on Irish unification, should a majority of people on both sides of the border agree to it. In the first Northern Irish election after the Good Friday Agreement, Sinn Féin won 18 seats, their most ever.
So the beauty of the Good Friday Agreement is that it was a very brief document, really, compared to many peace agreements.
Historian Eleanor Williams again.
The Good Friday Agreement was great in that sense because it was vague enough to be sold to both communities and everybody could see something that they wanted in the agreement. Not everybody had everything they wanted and people had to accept things that they didn't want as well. What that's meant long term is things such as victims have just not been incorporated into the Good Friday Agreement. The long-term legacy of the conflict was not really brought into the agreement.
George Mitchell, in his closing speech, said that this was just the beginning. It was the beginning of the beginning. And there was to be many years, decades of ups and downs, but we knew this wasn't going to happen overnight. Of course it wasn't. Things like this don't.
Coming up on From Bomb to Ballot.
This afternoon they took away children's clothing, their toys, and the pushchairs their mothers had used to bring them here, oblivious of what awaited them. Boys and girls and women make up the majority of those injured and the majority of those murdered.
I remember going into that mortuary and sitting down, and the family that was just in front of me, the man's wife was missing, was in the mortuary. His daughter was in the mortuary. His granddaughter was in the mortuary. You had 3 generations.
This is really the whole point of holding a political party accountable. You know, their offices were used by the IRA, so of course they're accountable.
The IRA would have no alternative but to manage as best they can the areas as well. So, and of course mistakes were made.
From Bomb to Ballot is presented by me, John Lee. It is produced by Artemis, Irvine and Bella Soames. The assistant producer is Sally McLennan. Sound design is by John Scott. Podcast artwork is by Lindsay Fagan. The script consultant is Liam Thompson.
These are violent criminals, so they're not going to go down easy.
ABC Tuesdays.
Let's get this done.
The Rookie is back.
We have 2 new rookies starting today.
Howdy.
Being a cop is stressful 24/7. Every year on the job is different.
And Training Day.
We have a serial killer at large.
Never ends.
We need an ambulance!
The Rookie. All new Tuesdays on ABC and stream on Hulu.